When you're working on your thumbnails and first laying out your panels, how do you choose what size and shape for each of your panels? Ooh woo, that can be very difficult, but I can tell you a few things about what the different sizes and shapes of panels mean for your comics, and maybe that can make these decisions a little bit easier. So, things to consider about panels. First, the size. The larger a panel is, the longer your reader is going to linger on it. And the smaller a panel, the faster your reader will look at it and then move on to the next panel. You can use this concept, I guess, to control the pacing of your story. If you need someone to stop and examine like an important object or a character moment or an event, use a larger panel. The largest panels being either a splash page or maybe a 2-page spread. And if you need your reader to skip through a bunch of small little panels or convey that time is moving very quickly in your story, using tiny panels can convey that. As for the shape, I find the shape is a little more subjective. I find that size rule is usually like what I start with when I'm planning out my panels. It's like, okay, here's like where I need things to go fast, here's where I need things to slow down, here's a really important moment, so I'm going to put it in a big panel. But when it comes to the shape of my panels, it's a little more subjective, I guess. So typically a comic will have rectangles and squares for their panels, with gutters between each panel. Gutters are just that white space that you'll see between different panels. And typically I'd recommend keeping space between your panels, keeping that gutter space, simply because it gives breathing room between each panel. However, if you really want your panels to be like flush up against each other, that's totally fine, if it suits your style or if it's just a visual choice that you want for your comic. That's cool. So for the most part, your comic will probably just be rectangles and squares. That's fine. I think most people who read comics kind of understand that as like the typical format for comics, so it's fine. It will blend into the background, no one will notice it. If you want to use a dynamic panel shape, so for example using circles or diagonal lines for your panels, or putting your panels in weird shapes like hearts or stars or hexagons or whatever you want, you can use those panels to convey heightened emotion, or you can also use those panels to direct readers around the page, meaning like they can contribute to your comic flow, which is the concept I'll talk about next video, actually. So if you have all your panels that they are like squares and rectangles, they're pretty uniform, they're cool, and then you suddenly have a panel that is like a diagonal slash across the page, or you suddenly have a panel that's a circle, people are going to look at it. It's going to draw their attention, and you can use it to direct them to the next panel or to a weird panel, whatever. But if you use them sparingly, they're going to grab attention, and you can really use them to heighten certain emotions or to direct focus. Honestly, if you wanted a comic that was all dynamic panels, that's okay, but they'll become the rectangles and squares of like most comics. If every single panel is dynamic, it's going to blend into the background. People aren't going to notice. So maybe they might notice if you put in just like a rectangle panel somewhere. It's all up to you. So now that you know kind of like the basics of like the size and shape of panels, here are some examples of some typical shots you might put into different sizes and shapes of panels. So the ones that come to the top of my mind, one would be an establishing shot. An establishing shot just shows off your setting. So for example, if your scene changes to like a city, you might want an establishing shot showing like, hey, here's the city, or here's the house they're in. Usually for this, it's best to use a wide panel that can let the setting breathe and be looked at. You don't want it to be in a tight little narrow panel that's really cramped. Typically, all these rules can be broken, obviously, if it works for your setting. But a wide shot typically works for like a landscape or a city shot or whatever. And it gives people time to study this setting and understand what it is before they move on to the rest of the scene. Number 2 would be call-out panels. These are usually small panels that overlay on top of the other panels or larger panels, and they're usually to show off a character's expression or reaction to an event that's just happened. It can be used to focus on an object or maybe like a part of someone's body and just kind of bring it into focus so that it sticks in your reader's mind. For example, you can have a call-out panel of like a special dagger that someone just slipped into their pocket, or the color of a character's eyes if that's like really significant to the story. Number 3 would be splash pages or spreads, which can be like one full page of comic that's just one panel, or 2 full pages that's just one panel. Typically, these are saved for panels that need a lot of focus or have lots of information to convey. They can convey like a sense of wonder. Say you're looking at like the new impressive school that your character is about to attend. They can be used to, show off a setting like that, or they can be used to maybe make a character feel very isolated. If you have a character who's standing in the center of this big field of just like black ink, that can feel very isolating. You can use a splash or a spread to show off a city street that's bustling with life, where you need to show lots of people and events and details, and it gives people lots of time to look through it and understand all these details instead of trying to cram it all into a smaller panel. Other than that, number 4, I guess, there's lots of other shots that can be used in a variety of panels, and they can convey different things depending on the size and shape of the panel. So for example, close-ups, which are kind of self-explanatory. It's usually a close-up on someone's face or their body or an object. You can put this in small panels, you can put it in big panels, you can do different shapes just to convey different emotions for this panel. It all depends on what you're trying to convey. If you want someone to linger on someone's expression for a long time, make it a big panel. If you want it to be a quick little reaction, you can use a small panel. It's all up to you. Same goes for mid shots. These shots usually show a character, maybe from like the waist up. It's a way to show their body language and to also show small amounts of background information, whereas like in a close-up, you might not be showing background information. You're probably just showing the face or the object. With a mid shot, you're showing more information around the character as well as them, or around the object. And again, this can go for small panels. If it's, say, just a character saying something and you just need to see their body language as they say it. It could be a large panel if that's a really important thing that they're saying, and maybe there's like details in the background you need to see as well. It all depends on what you're conveying, like I keep saying. And finally, there's long shots. So these usually show like a large amount of background information. They show the full body of your character. There's varying lengths of, I guess, like distance from the character you can show. You can show like lots of scenery around them, or you can just show enough to show their full body and some background information. So these are good for showing like the full body of your character, like I said. Usually I associate these with like comedic shots, or like showing off the background shots, or like isolating a character shots. Maybe that's just me. But yes, they're good for showing your character in the environment. And again, you can put this in a small panel if it's just something quick you need to show, like a quick isolating moment or a quick comedic moment. Or you could put this in a big panel where you're focusing a lot on the character's body language or a lot on the background. And this is a very important part of the scene. That is when you can put this in a large panel. And this applies to all these things. So I guess my final tips for like choosing the size and shape of all your panels. Make sure you're varying up your arrangement of the size and shapes on every page. So, when you're looking at your thumbnails and you're designing them, make sure that you don't have the exact same layout for every single page, or you don't have the exact same layout for like 2 pages side by side, at the very least. Unless you're trying to evoke something by having all the pages look the same, but try to vary it up as much as you can, with as appropriate as you can keep it to your script or your story. If something really has to be the same, then do it. There's nothing wrong with that, but try to vary it up where you can. It keeps things interesting. If you're going to put in dynamic shapes or weird shapes for your panels, use them to convey like important moments or to convey emotions. Putting too many in everywhere might be a little drawing for readers. And like I said before, they might start to blend in together and just become like the style of your comic instead of having them pop out and really mean something. So maybe, it depends on what you're going for, but like leave those for like really important moments unless you have a style where you want there to be lots of those weird shaped panels. I have these numbered, but I keep not saying the numbers. So number 3, play around with the visual style of your panels as well. For a previous comic, Pretty Mouth, I've done kind of like wiggly stylized panel outlines, like the literal line outlining my panel. The way you draw your panels, whether it's like a sketchy line or a really clean line or textured, whatever it is, this can really convey mood about your comic, and it's definitely something to consider when you're like figuring out your visual style for your comic. So like if you want to go simple and you just want the panels to blend into the background using just like a simple clean line, like a thin or a medium line, or even a thick line, it doesn't really matter. that's totally fine. You don't have to do anything super stylized with your comic panel lines, but it's something to play around with if it's something you're interested in. Some people don't even put lines on their panels. It's just like, you know, all the content of the panel just hits an edge and then you have white gutters that just kind of surround everything. I've seen this a lot with like colored comics or comics that kind of like have a wash over everything inside the panels. It's up to you. You can do whatever you want. So number 4, experiment with the size of panel and what you're placing inside that panel. Like I said, like there's a whole bunch of different like shot compositions that you can do at various sizes. Play around with those. You know, what does a close-up shot of a character's face signify if you put it in a really big panel? What does it mean if you put it in a tiny panel? Same goes for like an establishing shot where you're showing off your setting. You know, if it's in a small panel, what does that mean? If it's in a big panel, what does that mean? Just play around with it, see what works for that scene that you're working on, and play around, especially while you're working on your thumbnails here. Because, like I said, you don't have to put in a lot of effort to make changes to your thumbnails, so here's the time to play around with your panel compositions. Number 5, don't be afraid to play around with, like, breaking panels as well. The one I always kind of think of when I talk about this concept is like, have you ever read like a shoujo manga where like the one of the romantic interests shows up and he'll get like a full body image of him that kind of overlaps the other panels and there might be like sparkles and stuff around him, right? Like, that's a great way to break panels, and it has a significance to why it's displayed this way. It kind of breaks the flow of things. It's as if, like, he's grabbing the main character's attention. You really get to, like, look at him, and in a shoujo where, like, there's supposed to be pretty boys and stuff, you get to admire him. That's just a great use of, like, breaking panels to really convey something. So think of different ways that you can break your panels, I guess, or like play around with different styles of panels. For example, if all your stuff is like in square or rectangle panels and suddenly you do one that doesn't have any outlines or whatever, play around, see what meaning you can infuse to that and make it work for your story. You know, it's fine to play around with things like this as long as you're keeping kind of a purpose in mind. You're not just doing it for fun. I guess, like, it's fine to do it because it looks cool, because there's definitely, like, merit to that when you're making comics. But, like, I don't know, if you didn't know what to do with a thing, maybe just keep it to, like, really simple panels. Otherwise, you might be putting significance on a thing that doesn't need significance in your story, and you might be confusing readers. So, be careful, fam. So yeah, like I said, this might take a few tries to get right when you're thumbnailing. It's a good idea to try various panel layouts. You know, your first attempt at something might not feel right, so it's okay to try different shapes and sizes until you find an arrangement you like. So yeah, I hope that helps. I hope that helps you understand panels a bit more. I know it can be very daunting when you're starting, because you're like, you've read comics, you know what they look like, but you're like, why did they do this? Why did they choose this thing and not this thing? So hopefully this gives you a little bit more understanding of what's going on in those comics. And as always, you can always look at comics you like and just try to figure out why they did the things they did. Why did they make this panel this size? There's probably a reason. Read the comic and figure it out, I guess. You know, it's like studying your faves to understand their choices. Oh, hi, Fadel. I have my recording buddy with me, of course. Thank you so much for listening. I'm gonna go. I haven't had breakfast yet. I'm really hungry, and my animals are really hungry, so I'm gonna go. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more 100 Days of Making Comic Stuff. And thank you so much for watching. Bones and I really appreciate it. You're helping us kind of get through this really long video series. So thank you so much. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.